Welcome to Global Bytes. In the early morning of 20th January 2017, Donald J. Trump stood before the US Capitol, hand on the Lincoln Bible, and vote to put America first. His words were clear: the United States, he said, had been ripped off for decades by unfair trade deals, and that was going to end. What few realized that day was that the seeds of a trade confrontation had already been planted. A confrontation that would span 3 years, rattle global markets, unsettle allies, and alter the very foundations of modern commerce. This was the Trump tariff war. The setup. To understand the tariff war, we need to rewind. For decades, US leaders complained that countries like China were gaining an edge, manipulating currency, flooding markets with cheap exports, and stealing intellectual property from American companies. But the complaints rarely turned into sustained action. Donald Trump, however, made trade a central theme of his 2016 campaign. On the trail, he told crowds in Michigan and Ohio that America's factories were empty shells because jobs had been sent overseas. He promised sweeping tariffs on countries that, in his view, played dirty. So, what is a tariff? It's a tax on imports. But who actually pays? Part of it's absorbed by the exporter, part by the importer, and part maybe most by you, the consumer. A major NBR study shows much of the cost is passed straight to US buyers. Brookings found that while tariffs protect certain industries, they often make everything else more expensive. A tariff might protect a steel plant, but your grocery bill, your car payment, your construction costs, they all creep up. By spring 2017, Trump's advisors were split. The globalists, led by Gary Cohn, argued for caution. The economic nationalists, led by Peter Navarro and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, pushed for aggressive action. Trump sided with the nationalists. The first shots. On 1 March 2018, the first major salvo came. Citing Section 232 of a 1962 trade law, Trump announced tariffs of 25% on imported steel and 10% on imported aluminum, claiming national security concerns. Allies were stunned. Canada, the European Union, Mexico, South Korea, longtime US partners, were suddenly in the crosshairs. Markets wobbled. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell sharply as investors worried about retaliation. This is a dramatic move, one that could spark a trade war. They were right. Enter China. While allies negotiated exemptions, one country loomed largest: China. On 22 March 2018, Trump signed a memorandum targeting what the administration called China's unfair trade practices. The US Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, released a Section 301 investigation report, 200+ pages alleging massive theft of American intellectual property. The penalty: tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. China responded within hours. Beijing announced its own tariffs on $3 billion of US goods, from pork to wine. It was the first direct exchange of fire. Escalation. April 2018. The US published a list of 1,300 Chinese products facing new duties. China countered with tariffs on soybeans, cars, and airplanes, targeting industries deep in Trump-supporting states. By July, the US tariffs took effect and China matched them, dollar for dollar. In September 2018, Trump escalated again, tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports at 10%, with a threat to raise them to 25%. China retaliated with $60 billion in tariffs. Markets turned volatile. American farmers, especially soybean growers, saw exports to China plummet. The administration rolled out a $12 billion farm aid package, a band-aid for the political wounds opening in rural America. The world reacts. This was no longer just a US-China fight. The European Union hit back over steel and aluminum tariffs, with duties on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, bourbon whiskey, and Levi's jeans. Canada imposed tariffs on US steel, aluminum, and dozens of consumer goods. Global trade flows began to shift. Some companies moved supply chains out of China to avoid tariffs. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico gained. But uncertainty was the new normal. Temporary truce. 1st December 2018, Buenos Aires, Argentina. At the G20 summit, Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping sat down for a tense dinner. They agreed to a 90-day truce. Negotiations would continue. The tariff increase scheduled for January would be postponed. Markets rallied briefly. But beneath the smiles, mistrust remained. Talks collapse. Spring 2019. Talks progressed until May. The US accused China of backtracking on commitments, especially over enforcing intellectual property protections. Trump tweeted that tariffs on $200 billion in Chinese goods would rise from 10% to 25%. China retaliated with tariffs on $60 billion in US products. The fragile truce was over. The currency clash. In August 2019, the US Treasury labeled China a currency manipulator, the first time since 1994. China's yuan had fallen past the symbolic $7 per dollar mark. Markets plunged again. Trump ordered US companies to start looking for an alternative to China. Though not legally binding, the message was clear: decouple. Phase 1. 15th January 2020, Washington, D.C. After nearly 2 years, the two sides signed the Phase 1 trade agreement. China pledged to buy an additional $200 billion in US goods and services over 2 years. The US agreed to halve tariffs on $120 billion in Chinese imports, but most duties remained. It was not peace, it was a ceasefire. The pandemic factor. Weeks later, COVID-19 spread across the globe. Trade volumes collapsed for reasons far beyond tariffs. China missed its purchase commitments. The tariff war faded from headlines, but the barriers stayed in place. The legacy. By the end of Trump's term, tariffs covered $370 billion in Chinese imports. China had retaliated with duties on $110 billion of US goods. Global supply chains were reshaped, trust between the two largest economies was damaged, and the concept of free trade had taken a political hit. Supporters say Trump was the first president in decades to confront China head-on. Critics say the war hurt American consumers, businesses, and farmers without fundamentally changing China's behavior. In the end, the Trump tariff war didn't end with a treaty or a decisive winner. It ended with an uneasy stalemate. Tariffs remain. The world still feels the aftershocks. And the question lingers. Was this the opening battle of a longer conflict or a warning shot that will echo through history? Fast forward to 2025. Most of those tariffs are still here. Recent presidential proclamations keep adjusting rules for steel and aluminum imports. It's a reminder. What began in 2018 still shapes trade today. Tariffs remain a go-to tactic to protect industries, negotiate deals, and signal strength. What started as a bold policy became a tangled web of consequences. From steel taxes to soybean shocks. From trade wars to trade lessons. And the cost. Often carried by everyday people. For full sources, from USTR to NBR, check the description. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown useful, like, share, and subscribe to Global Bytes. And I'll see you in the next one.